We'll first start with Dr. Laura Sudulich. She will present a paper on Northern Irish citizen preferences for border arrangements after Brexit, evidence from a conjoint survey experiment. Dr. Sudulich is a senior lecturer in politics at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. She's also affiliated to the Centre d'études de la vie politique, CEVIPOL, Université de Bruxelles. During the academic year 2012-2013, she was a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute and holds a PhD in political science from Trinity College, Dublin. She has worked at the University of Amsterdam as a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow, where she contributed to the support and opposition to migration project known as SOM, funded by the European Commission. She has taught a number of courses on new technologies and electoral competition, media and politics, electoral campaigns, research methods, and politicization of immigration. Dr. Sudulich, your floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to present a paper that is co-authored with Neo, Ed, and Fergal, who is not here with us. So it's a product of the University of Kent's team. And what I'm going to do is fundamentally two things. I'll describe a little bit the broader project, the broader framework of the project we are working at, and then I will present findings from this first sort of pilot survey experiment that we ran in Northern Ireland last year. So let me start with describing the idea behind this grant that we hold from the United States Institute of Peace. Fundamentally, we are concerned with the fact that in divided societies, there's a lot of focus on finding solutions and designing arrangements for transitioning to more stable setup. And in such a process, we often find elites to be the ones that receive not only the largest chunk of attention, but the ones we as observers end up being concerned with, right? So we always think of negotiating processes as the product of community leaders, and we sort of leave aside those who have to live with the consequences of whatever community leaders negotiate. So our focus here is on public opinion, is on those who have to live with the consequences of peace arrangements. The assumption here is that if we can account for citizen preferences before arrangements are reached, then we are set for a good start for arrangements to be durable and to be guaranteed legitimacy. So if there is popular legitimacy attached to peace agreements, then we have a better chance of stable and durable peace processes. And this is really what drove us to write this grant application and study two contexts that are quite different. So we focus on Cyprus and Northern Ireland. And they're quite different because where in Cyprus there is no solution on the table, Northern Ireland has been living with a peace solution for the past 20 years. The fundamental difference is that in Northern Ireland, peace is the status quo, and in Cyprus, we haven't reached that point yet. So that's why we thought these two contexts were particularly interesting to us. And Northern Ireland is particularly interesting right now because it's subject to the Brexit shock. So there'll be a number of things to be negotiated and re-established in the aftermath of Brexit. We believe that it's important to map public opinion in advance of any negotiating process. Otherwise, we end up with situations like the rejected agreement in Cyprus in 2004, or what happened in Colombia with the Colombian referendum in 2016. So we think if there's more transparency on what, and awareness on what people would support that should bring enhanced information to the peace negotiating tables and possibly set up things for a better start and an even better ending. So we believe that this matters because in conflict society or post-conflict society, we often observe these two or more communities being sort of trapped in this narrative of us and them, which is very often based on misconceptions. And that applies to people, but also to elites. We think we know what the other community wants, what the other community is after, but there is no real transparency on what the other community or members of the other communities really prefer. And we believe that this sort of awareness is also helpful for negotiators, which very often have set their own agenda and have sort of compartmentalized knowledge. So they've boxed in preferences, and through the application of this methodology, we can offer a richer and more open sense of what really are the preferences within each community. The third reason why we believe this is important, this is interesting, is because we can survey and we can apply, we can extract this knowledge from groups that very often tend to be marginalized. And in the case of our Cyprus study, we'll be studying those living in the island as well as the two diasporas. So we think that bringing to the table more points of views of relevant actors, even if minorities, is generally gonna produce better negotiating processes. And again, what negotiators would or could do with that is not so much up to us, but more information is better than less. Now, how it matters? Well, because it does reduce these information asymmetries that exist in divided societies, and very often information asymmetries that exist between citizens and elites. So the short end of our motivation is that we believe having more knowledge and better knowledge would promote legitimized solutions. And that's particularly important when peace processes are due to be ratified by referendums or by electoral processes. And that talks quite a bit to the current situation in the Brexit negotiations as much as in the negotiation in Cyprus and in Northern Ireland. So now I want to talk about our study of Northern Ireland. And while I know that this is not particularly impressive here, it's a picture of a border, and I'm sure it's something you're familiar with. When I show this in other places, people are not used to seeing borders and find it particularly scary. I'm sure here it doesn't sort the same reaction, but this is actually is not even a real border. This was a protest that took place a couple of months ago on the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, where protesters reenacted what used to be the border in place 20 years ago. And in order to avoid a situation under which the border is re-established, we would have to go beyond the idea of a no-deal scenario in the Brexit negotiations. So Brexit, when it comes to Brexit, it's very hard to summarize what is going on. So I found a picture that sort of tells what's going on right now in the Brexit negotiations. We are sort of trapped, and a lot of people feel that we need help. Now I'm gonna state a few facts about Brexit and its consequences for Northern Ireland. This slide used to be the UK will leave the European Union on March 29. Now we have gone past March 29th and we're still here. Now, we know that Northern Irish citizens strongly oppose the idea of Brexit. So 56% of citizens in Northern Ireland voted to remain. So it's sort of imposed over the will of the majority of citizens. And there are a number of oddities that have been taking place in the politics of Northern Ireland in these past 2 years. The first of them being the power-sharing governments being out of business for such an extended period of time. And the second one is the Democratic Unionist Party being pivotal to the survival of the UK government. And I'm sure you're all familiar with what is happening these days. Now, one of the reasons why citizens of Northern Ireland would prefer to remain in the European Union has to do possibly with the guarantees for peace, but there are strong economic reasons why Northern Ireland prefers remaining in the European Union, and most of all the fact that the region strongly depends on subsidies for agriculture. So I'm just going to move on to our study, and if you have questions on the context, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. So the issue of the border has often been treated as a dichotomy, border, no border. But the border really encompasses a number of dimensions that have to do with security, with the economy, and with the symbolism. And we think that it's important to sort of break down all these elements, and we do so by means of conjoint experiments. And I'll tell you a couple of words about how we ran these experiments last year. So we presented respondents with two packages that contain a number of dimensions that have to do with the economy, with identity and security concerns. And we broke this complexity down in 5 dimensions, which we can define as 5 problems that need solution. And for each of these problems, we attributed values, which, again, we can look at as solutions to that particular problem. So just to give an example, one of the biggest problem has to do with the location of the border. Where is this border going to be located? Is it going to be in the island of Ireland between the north and the south, or in the Irish Sea between the east and the west? So we call north-south and east-west solution for the border location. Then there are arrangements to be made for border crossing checks. Are these checks going to be physical? Are they going to be digital? Is there even the possibility of no checks whatsoever? And we allowed for all these potential solutions. On top of this, we have, and I won't describe all the options, we have arrangements to be made for the maintenance, control of the border, and we allowed for the fact that citizens of Northern Ireland that were against leaving the European Union should be or could be compensated with an increase in public spending. And we allowed for different percentages of increase or no increase whatsoever. So I'm going to skip quickly to our findings here that enable us to map the preferences of the two communities vis-a-vis each other. And here, a simple way of looking at this map is when you see the dot, which is the point estimate of the two communities, when you see the blue and the black dot close to each other, means that the two communities are in alignment. So they would, in principle, agree to these solutions. And as you can see, they would both prefer to be compensated. They would both prefer for maintenance and border checks to be performed by the two states together. And they would both prefer mild forms of checks. So checks that are not time-consuming and economically expensive. Now, where we see this agreement is on the location of the border, which is carrying all these symbolic elements. Clearly, the unionists would prefer a land border, and the nationalists would prefer a border in the Irish Sea. Now, the type of analysis that we conducted and we are due to replicate in Cyprus and in a future study of Northern Ireland enable us to simulate various potential agreements and estimate the overall support and the bi-community support for each and every one of those simulated agreements. And I just want to talk about the first one, which is the no-deal scenario. If everything goes wrong, that's what would happen next Friday. So there would be a border between the north and the south of the island of Ireland. There'd be physical checks. There'd be separated teams performing the checks. Maintenance should be up to the UK, and there'd be no compensation due to citizens of Northern Ireland. Now, what I think is interesting here is that not only we see that overall this scenario would receive just about 40% of popular support, and while we sort of anticipated that in the nationalist community this scenario would be particularly unpopular, what is interesting is that even within the unionist community, it will reach a bare 50% of support. So 1 out of 2 unionists wouldn't be happy with a no-deal scenario, which is something you wouldn't necessarily gather by reading the paper and getting the point of view of leaders of the DUP. Now, there are a number of other potential scenarios that we could simulate, and the last one is the one that would secure reaching 50% plus across both communities. Now, the takeaway message is very simple. There's quite a lot of consensus, quite more than we would think, and no deal is unpopular across the board. So we're going to replicate this in Northern Ireland and in Cyprus. And I think my time is up. Thank you.
So just keeps something very important that it was just said. We need to account for citizens' preferences in advance before we embark on negotiations, because that legitimizes the process, and it's something which there's a big question mark whether this happens in Cyprus or not. So I'm making sure that it's heard today again. Charis, you're taking the floor now. Okay, Charis Psaltis is an associate professor of social and developmental psychology at the University of Cyprus. He worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Centre for the Study of Intergroup Conflict, Department of Experimental Psychology, University of Oxford. He published papers in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, European Journal of Social Psychology, British Journal of Developmental Psychology, Culture and Psychology, papers on social representations and human development. He is a director of the University of Cyprus Center for Field Studies and co-founder and co-director of the Genetic Social Psychology Lab in the Department of Psychology of the University of Cyprus. Charis will be talking today. He will be comparing the views of internally displaced persons and non-internally displaced persons' views on the Guterres Package. Dr. Psaltis, the floor is yours. You've got 15 minutes.
Thank you, Anna. This is work that we are currently working on for a paper with Neophytos Loizidis, Huseyin Cakal, and Ishik Kusku. The title, as you see, concerns the views of Greek Cypriot IDPs in terms of resolving the Cyprus issue, and specifically about the issue of power sharing and the Guterres Package. So the presentation focuses on Greek Cypriot and internally displaced persons, political attitudes to power sharing. We utilize quantitative data from two large surveys conducted in 2016 and 2017, probing respondents on their views on territorial readjustments, property provisions, and power sharing. Contrary to findings in the literature, IDP status is associated in our research with higher levels of support for a negotiated peace settlement. The article examines the impact of anticipated threats and economic opportunities accompanying a settlement and suggests a set of institutionalized mechanisms to incorporate the views of IDPs and other disadvantaged groups in future reunification talks. Some key points: internally displaced persons and their rights are important to peace mediation, but are systematically excluded from elite-driven agreements, so that's something to keep in mind why we need this kind of research. Peace processes rarely facilitate the institutionalized participation of IDPs and other vulnerable groups, nor do they encourage information gathering as to broader citizen preferences. And Cyprus provides a paradigmatic case where the right of return has been a key priority, especially for Greek Cypriots, yet IDPs are not represented at negotiations and there is no related research on the advantages of their participation. Here are the key questions of this presentation. First, we need to establish how many are the IDPs in the Greek Cypriot community and the people affected more broadly by the property dossier in the negotiations. What percentage of the Greek Cypriot electorate and displaced are affected by displacement and with what criteria? Second, the presentation addresses the exclusion of IDPs and the gap in peace studies in public opinion research using two large-scale surveys focusing on Greek Cypriot displaced persons and their attitudes to the prospective political institutions of a reunited Cyprus. This new quantitative data is collected before and after the 2017 UN peace talks that collapsed at Grand Montana. And then there is a third question here: what are the social psychological antecedents of support or lack of support for a peace solution? Answering this question allows us to locate a real-life political phenomenon in everyday intergroup behavior, past and present. So this is the methodology of the first study. This was a sample of 1,605 participants, Greek Cypriots, 18 years old and over, with voting rights. The data were collected from the 21st of February until the 22nd March in 2016. This was a telephone survey with a structured questionnaire. The margin of error was 3%, and the data collection was undertaken by the University Center for Field Studies here in the University of Cyprus. The questionnaire was designed by Neophytos Loizidis, George Stefanovic, and myself. So some important baseline, if you like, information about IDPs. First, those who became personally displaced in 1974 is about 20%. Those whose father became displaced in 1974, 30.1%. Those whose mother became displaced, 29.1%. Then people who were displaced through poverty, in other words, they had property, irrespective of whether they stayed during the displacement or not there. So these are 37% of the population. Displaced through descent, having at least one grandparent who was born in the north, 38%. And then affected by a possible settlement and the property dossier by having a spouse who is an IDP, that's 20.4% of the population. So the interesting point here is that you can actually aggregate all these categories, and then you realize that more than 50% of the population somehow is affected by the property issue. For this analysis that I will be presenting later on, we take a more conservative criterion to define IDPs. So we exclude the people who are married to IDPs, and we just focus on people whose mother or father is an IDP or themselves, or they have property. And we just code in a binary form, so in a 0-1 format, in what you will see later on. So first, there was the question of whether they are interested in returning in case of a solution. And here the most interesting finding is that you see that that depends a lot on whether it is under Greek Cypriot administration or under Turkish Cypriot administration. If it is under Greek Cypriot administration, you see that those who say that it is unlikely or very unlikely, that goes up to 76. So there's only about 22% that say it's likely or very likely to return under Turkish Cypriot administration. But if you ask the same question under Greek Cypriot administration, then the people who are likely to return are about 60%. So this is a huge difference. Then we ask the questions under a referendum scenario, and we compare the views of IDPs and non-IDPs. And here there is a very interesting finding. You see that in this specific group of people who say that I would vote no for sure in case of a referendum, the people who are non-IDPs are almost double the people who are IDPs. So let's put it that way. Among the most hardliners in rejecting a possible peace plan, it is very likely you will find people who are non-displaced people in that group. And this is a particular group, the undecided voters. And what we did is that we specifically asked this group of people what kind of possible variations of a plan could make them vote yes or no towards a peace plan. So the majority of these people voted yes in the case where they were told that the IDPs will have the possibility to have a fair say on their properties. So they would decide on how the property will be handled. And this is very important because we did not find a significant difference between IDPs and non-IDPs. So it is equally important for IDPs and non-IDPs that the IDPs will have a say on their property. So I guess that needs an explanation here. I think it goes to the heart of the social representation of what the Cyprus problem is for Greek Cypriot. I think there the core of it is that there has been occupation and that somehow we need to lift the occupation. So I think that's the reason why we see it's equally important for both IDPs and non-IDPs that the IDPs should have a say on their property. And then we ask the question of the rotational presidency. We ask under what condition they could support the rotational presidency. And here we had an interesting finding, which is the first, about half of the population of undecided voters say that under no circumstance I would support the rotational presidency. So this is something to think about, and I think the whole conference here and the debates we are having about semi-presidentialism, etc., in a way answer to the need to further explore variations among the federal umbrella of resolving the problem. But again, you see that IDPs and non-IDPs differ here. You see that the IDPs are more ready to accept power sharing in this form compared to non-IDPs. And now I move to the second study. This is a face-to-face interview, 811 Greek Cypriots with voting rights. This was data were collected November, December 2017. So it was a few months after the collapse of the Crans-Montana negotiations. And here there's an interesting question. It's whether the IDPs feel that the burden of displacement has been equally distributed between all Greek Cypriot citizens of the Republic of Cyprus or not. And the second question, whether they are ready to take a more assertive stance. The Greek translation was to take πιο δυναμικά μέτρα, to claim such a more fairer distribution. And it was very interesting because we found that the vast majority of IDPs selected the extreme of the Likert scale, saying that we definitely feel that we have been unjustly treated, and we definitely are ready to take more dynamic or more assertive measures to somehow deal with this issue. So I think this is very important for people here like Celia and other people who I know they are trying to explore possibilities for IDPs, how to mobilize and claim their rights. Then we also asked about the social psychological predictors of accepting power sharing arrangements. Now, Greek Cypriots are worried about Turkey interfering in the federal state, about getting a dysfunctional solution, and about Greek Cypriots being unready for a possible solution. An exception is symbolic threats to Greek Cypriot way of life, which was close to the mean, so it didn't seem to play such a big role in this research. More participants show intergroup distrust than trust, and the majority is unable to recognize the positive effects of intergroup relations and contact stemming from the opening of the checkpoints in 2003, even though there is much empirical evidence by now that shows that it has had a positive impact on bicommunal relations. On the positive side, the majority of participants recognize that the opportunities offered by a solution for economic development and free movement around Cyprus are recognized. We also tried to run a model, and I'm finishing with this, of what are the factors that predict the acceptance of power sharing. And not generally, but actually a specific trade-off between giving power sharing to Turkish Cypriots in exchange of more food. So that was the kind of specific trade-off we tried to explore. And we found that first, gender was a major predictor. Men were more likely compared to women to accept power sharing. Second, the IDP status. So IDPs were more ready to accept compared to non-IDPs. Then we had a major impact by the set of social psychological variables, the fears and the hopes for a solution, the threats, those played a major role. And we also had some CBM-related measures like the positive attitude towards the opening of the checkpoints. People who supported the opening of the checkpoints and contact were more ready to accept power sharing. And also people who had more trust, again, were more likely to accept power sharing. So, to finish my presentation, as the majority is still undecided on the Guterres framework, there is clearly space for renegotiating ways of power sharing beyond a rotating presidency, which might face difficulties in getting accepted by Greek Cypriots in a referendum. For example, semi-presidentialism discussed today might be an option, or a parliamentary system. A give and take between aspects of the Guterres framework that are of equal importance to the two communities, endorsing power sharing in return for the annulment of security guarantees, for example, can be thought of as an alternative to other trade-offs. But we need further research here. Conjoint analysis that was discussed by Laura, I think, is the way forward. And to conclude, any formula will have to take to safeguard the participation of Turkish Cypriots in power sharing, but without giving Turkey the power to block or influence decision-making. Otherwise, gaining a majority in referendum in the Greek Cypriot community will not be possible, as the majority of Greek Cypriots express major concerns about possible Turkish interference in the federation. If there is a renewed effort to resolve the problem, confidence-building measures should be taken to improve the low levels of trust, as these play a significant role in reducing the acceptance of a compromise solution. The role of information and framing will be decisive, particularly among undecided Greek Cypriots, as demonstrated in comparable public opinion survey elsewhere. And I think it's also important, before a final solution, to further understand the needs of IDPs and how they want to deal with their properties. We had a specific proposal with Neophytos and Alexandros in the past, which, for those interested, can be downloaded. It's publicly available on the link that you see here, there. It's a proposal for a census of IDPs and their properties and their specific will and needs in terms of how to handle their properties. So if anybody wants, please send me an email and share it with you. Okay, thank you.
I think the key message we got here was actually was the one of inclusion. And I must say, as a Greek Cypriot and from an IDP family, when Charis first presented the results of this survey some time ago, I was shocked by the fact that IDPs were not really represented in the negotiating team, and they were not part of the decision-making team of people. So, and I have never thought that it mattered. So it just got me thinking. So an interesting piece of research. We can talk about it more in the questions and answers. Now we're moving on to Huseyin Cakal. Dr. Cakal will present his paper on with the title "To Return or Not to Return: The Role of Positive Contact in Alleviating the Psychological Cost of Returning to Pre-1974 Properties." Huseyin Cakal obtained an MSc in Sociology from the University of Manchester, Doctor of Philosophy in Social Psychology from the University of Oxford, before joining Keele University School of Psychology in 2016 as lecturer in psychology, and where he is now as an assistant professor. He has a particular passion for policy-oriented research on extremely disadvantaged communities in the least access regions in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Within the broad area of intergroup relations, Husein's work has covered the dynamics of collective action and prejudice reduction strategies, effects of social identity and intergroup contact on health and intergroup emotions among advantaged and disadvantaged groups. He has conducted research on these topics among some of the least accessible populations, such as indigenous people in South America, Christian minorities in Iraq, Muslims and Hindus in Kashmir, and among Bosnian Muslims.
Thank you. One of the nice things about presenting towards the end of the conference that previous presenters do your work for you. So thanks, Charis, for presenting most of the details related to this research. What I would like to today is first to introduce you what social psychological tools we have to understand real political problems like the happenings that or the things we call as a Cyprus problem or other similar issues in the broader world. So what I would like to do is I want to first introduce you some of the tools that we use in social psychology to understand these processes, and then present a portion of the data that we collected as a part of the same project, 2016 and 2017, and then perhaps maybe leave a couple of take-home messages if you like it. So as social psychology, we are interested in how people's behavior, emotions, and attitudes towards each other and towards themselves change in the presence of other people whom they identify as different from them. So whenever people interact with each other, being aware of the fact that they belong to different groups, we call these intergroup relations. And an important aspect of these intergroup relations is the social identity, the concept of ourselves that we use to define through our membership to different groups. This could be racial group like blacks and whites, this could be ethnicity, Turkish Cypriots, Greek Cypriots, or this could well be your social class or your profession, like as I introduced myself as a social psychologist or a political scientist. So it could be anything. And one of the foundational theoretical frameworks in social psychology we use is the social identity theory, which basically we can actually summarize as individuals try to feel good about the groups that they feel they belong to. And to achieve this positive distinctiveness from the other groups, they constantly compare themselves to the other groups that they share the same societal context. And when they feel better about their group, they want to do something to improve the things, improve the position of their group. One of the things that social identity theory gives us is that it acknowledges that in any plural society where there is a number of groups differ in their access to the resources, political, social, educational sources. And the intergroup relations within a context like this is driven by individuals' ability to either to maintain these differences or to challenge or to change them. Applying these tools, in a more practical aspect of intergroup relations, especially in places like Cyprus, we also can say that people also use their attachment to a particular place, their village, their country, their city, to define themselves. Like, I am from Cyprus, I'm from Lefkosia, or whatever, right? And we differentiate between the actual emotional bond that they have with this place and the part of their identity that they say, I am from this place. So we make a distinction between this emotional bond and the dimension of their identity that they derive from their, let's say, identification with that particular place. We also, in social psychology, we are also interested in how large-scale upheavals, like wars, like earthquakes, like other political changes, influence the human behavior. And particularly, looking at the different, how these upheavals influence different groups that we previously acknowledged that have differential access to these resources, are influenced by these social changes. Putting these in context, we could say that the intercommunal strife during the pre-1974 and 1970, there was a large-scale social change, albeit in a negative way. And in the prospective future settlement, prospective future peace agreement will be a social change in a positive way. One of the actual processes that elevate or improve people's attitudes towards each other, interactions, like when they come into contact, when they establish friendships with people from other groups. When this contact happens under certain conditions, like when people feel that they have the same status, that they are equal, and this contact between the individuals is supported by authorities, by law, by traditions, and they also have, when they have common goals to work towards, this contact between groups of people are most influential in changing their prejudices or biases that they have towards each other. Another key concept that we have in social psychology is the idea of a common in-group identity. Earlier I discussed how people define themselves in terms of the groups they belong to. Sometimes they think about themselves as they're belonging to a larger group that also includes people who have differences. Putting this again in context, we can say that when we think about Cyprus, a Cypriot identity is the common in-group identity that includes for Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots who among themselves differ as to the, in terms of the language they speak or some other values, traditions, and beliefs. This research has been going on for the last 60 years. So one of the main findings, tells us how contact and common in-group identity works. First of all, when you bring people into contact with each other, this improves their trust to each other. This improves their ability to take the perspective of the other groups. It also improves empathy. These are all psychological processes. It makes them more forgiving towards each other, and this is exceptionally important if you consider that sometimes these groups have been in violent conflict with each other in the past. It also reduces the perceptions of threats that they perceive from each other, or also their anxiety resulting from being in the presence of each other. Hundreds of studies. Overall, we can say that the actual contact and common in-group identity reduces, if we're thinking about prejudice, reduces prejudice substantially. Putting all these tools together and then applying this to a real political issue like the Cyprus problem, we wanted to understand how these processes influence internally displaced persons in the context of Cyprus, and how their motivations in the event of a peaceful solution, how their motivations to return to their pre-1974 properties by these processes. Why is it important? Well, it is important because Earlier, we discussed how a social change, a negative social change, influenced these people. These are the primary stakeholders, both who are influenced and who are very likely to be influenced in the event of a solution. Basically, we put several options to these people. For the Greek Cypriots, there are two options. In an event of solution, there will be a return to their properties under Greek Cypriot administration or Turkish Cypriot administration. For the Turkish Cypriots, mainly, this will be a return, most probably, because we are expecting some changes in terms of the land shifts. This will be a return to their properties under Greek Cypriot administration. And we asked three questions. How do long-term internally displaced persons emotionally experience their current residence? Do they have any attachment to the place they are living at the moment? We also wanted to answer the question of how their attachment to their Pre-74 properties influence their motivations. Do they really want to go back? And under what conditions? And what influenced these decisions? And finally, we also wanted to know what social psychological factors influence these decisions, possible decision-making process. We asked also their perceptions of threats posed by the other community. In terms of the threats, we differentiated between if they perceive the other group posing a threat to their tangible resources like political resources, economic resources like jobs, other resources. Also, in terms of the symbolic resources like their belief systems, their way of life, their values. And we measured these, we tried to answer these questions with different questions. We asked people about the contact they have with the other group. We asked people about their attachment to their old place, their identification with the new place. And more importantly, when they think about a possible return, what psychological difficulties they experience, what goes inside their heads. And we labeled this the psychological cost of return, a subjective state of mind that thinks, oh, I can't really go back because of this could happen, that could happen. So we asked all about these questions in our surveys that we conducted with Charis, with Neophytos, and with other colleagues. And what we found? We found, among others, that the more contact they have with the other group, this is the Turkish Cypriot IDPs, the more contact they have with the Greek Cypriots, this increases their attachment to their old place. And this, in return, motivated them to return to their old properties under Greek Cypriot administration. Interestingly, the interactions they have with the Greek Cypriots also decrease the psychological cost of return, which has a negative impact on their intentions to return. So altogether, we found strong evidence in favor of positive interactions, motivating the Turkish Cypriots to return to their properties, even under Greek Cypriot administration. Things got slightly more interesting when we look at the choices of the motivations to return of the Greek Cypriots. What we found, a direct impact of having positive relations with Turkish Cypriots, that Greek Cypriots, the more contact they had with the Turkish Cypriots, the more they wanted to return to their properties, even under Turkish Cypriot administration. So that was really interesting. And we also found that the attachment to the old place, their old properties, have a strong impact on their motivations to return. But this impact was influenced by their perceptions of threats from the Turkish Cypriots. Among the Turkish Cypriot IDPs, we found no evidence of these threats. So the Turkish Cypriots didn't perceive that they are threatened by the Greek Cypriots, but Greek Cypriots thought so. The other interesting thing we found, also again similar to the Turkish Cypriot community, more contact with the Turkish Cypriots decreased the psychological cost of return, and then this, again, the psychological cost of return influenced negatively return intentions under Turkish Cypriot administration, and as well as return intentions under Greek Cypriot administration. Perhaps the most interesting thing here is that the positive relations with the Turkish community increase the motivations of the Greek Cypriots to return to their old properties, irrespective of whose administration it is. So it doesn't matter if it is under Turkish administration or the Greek administration. The more contact they have with the Turkish Cypriots, they are more willing to return to their old properties. In terms of implications, we put the theoretical social psychological tools to a real social problem like the Cyprus problem, and we found that people contact positive interactions with the other groups actually reduce the psychological cost of return to, and also increasing the attachment to their old places. So the more contact they have, they feel more attachment to their old pre-1974 places. This, of course, means we need to do more research on real-life situations like Cyprus or elsewhere, which have similarities in terms of the intergroup relations. We also need to move away because majority of the contact literature, the social psychological literature, have been mainly conducted in the Western countries. But we need to move away from the Western context to the places like contexts where the actual problems are that can benefit from this kind of research most. And finally, in terms of the activists who are involved in peace efforts to bring solutions in places like Cyprus or elsewhere, a strong emphasis on the commonalities between the groups, like common identity, emphasis on developing social networks to facilitate even more contact between members of different two groups, and also using those resources to empower the communities across the divides to challenge the status quo and achieve, if they're working for peace, if they are working for an actual improvement of the conditions for that reason. Thank you.
Some interesting findings there. So more contact, assuming it's positive contact, then less psychological cost of return, more attachment to people's old properties, encouraging results in comparison with what we've seen before, that IDPs are quite reluctant, Greek Cypriots, to return under Turkish Cypriot administration. So there's something there that could act as a catalyst to change that predisposition. So that's quite interesting. And now we move to the last presentation, last but not least, Dr. Alexandros Lordos. The title of the talk is "Which Factors Underpin Support of the Minsk Agreements for Eastern Ukraine? A Longitudinal Investigation of the Post-Maidan Era." Some words about the speaker. Alexandros Lordos is a registered clinical psychologist and a lecturer of clinical psychology at the University of Cyprus. He's got a degree in modern and medieval languages from Cambridge, a psychology degree from the University of Crete, a postgraduate degree in counseling from Durham University, a PhD in clinical psychology from University of Cyprus. He's one of the founders of SEED, Center for Sustainable Peace and Democratic Development, and has worked with an array of international organizations like UNICEF, the World Bank, InterPeace, UNDP, the Office for Transition Initiatives of the USAID, and has been coordinating research programs in the Ukraine, Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Liberia, Rwanda, Iraq, Nepal, Malaysia, East Timor, and Cyprus. He's also been a visiting scholar in the Public Health School of Harvard University, and he's an international expert sitting with the International Peace Building Advisory Team, as well as a member of the board of the Resilient Lives Foundation. Alexandros?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. And even though our team has been doing research, and I would just want to give a note to some members of the team who are here today, Alex and Meltem. Even though our team has been doing research on Cyprus, deliberately opted to actually share some findings from Ukraine today so that we can broaden this comparative perspective. So I will focus on the Minsk Agreements, for instance, Ukraine and which factors underpin support for them. I'm aware that I'm not talking to a group of Ukraine experts here, so I will give you the 5-minute everything you wanted to know about the Ukraine conflict, but were afraid to ask presentation. So the current tensions started in November 2015, when protesters gathered at Maidan Square in central Kiev against the government's decisions to abandon plans for EU association agreement. This eventually led to the President Yanukovych, fleeing to Russia after security forces killed several protesters at Maidan Square. And immediately after the change of government in Kiev, Russia moved very swiftly to annex Crimea. And very soon after that, pro-Russia groups seized parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, with the Ukrainian government launching a counter-offensive in the region. And just to give you a sense of the geography, this is Kiev, yeah. So over here, yeah. So over here is Russia, Romania, Poland. This is Crimea, and this is the Donbas region of Ukraine, as it's called, Donetsk and Luhansk. Together, those two oblasts are called, oblast means districts. So together, those two oblasts are called the Donbas region, and this is the part of the Donbas that is currently held by separatist forces that are pro-Russia. And now, the conflict was very hot to start with, so this is one of the maps that was circulating at the time to indicate the state of the conflict. It was a very hot war, yeah. So the borderline was shifting day by day. Cities were being annexed, being taken over by the separatists. Then the Ukraine army was taking them back, and eventually, over time, the border has settled. And it would be wrong to make the Cypriot analogy and think that this means that it's now a frozen conflict. It's not a frozen conflict. It's currently a simmering conflict, like burning embers after you've had a big fire. So things are not yet settled down, but it's more like charcoal, burning hot charcoal all over the place. It's a conflict at that stage of its development. And this area is called the gray zone. So it's 15 kilometers on either side of the border. There is shelling and sporadic fighting going on there every day, despite the ceasefire. And in this conflict context, which has, of course, led to Ukraine not controlling 7% of its territory, so that's significant. Of course, it's a lot less than the Cypriot analog, as it were, but it's still a very significant chunk of the island that became separated away from the rest of the country. And in the midst of the active fighting, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, and the separatist-held areas negotiated a set of agreements, which are collectively known as the Minsk Agreements, which had several objectives that I will describe in a second. There was Minsk I was put the overall framework, as it were, and Minsk II in February 2015 included specific measures that was supposed to lead to an end of hostility, to a cessation of hostilities, and forge a path towards permanent peace. And these photos are well known, so people who are following the media may have seen those photos at the time. This photo has often been commented by saying that only Putin is smiling. Yeah. So, and there's a lot of the analysis of the Minsk Agreements was that Russia got what it wanted through those agreements, because of course because Ukraine and Europe were had a weak hand militarily at the time. They desperately needed the ceasefire, so they desperately needed an agreement. And I will explain in a moment what Ukrainians tend to think is wrong about these agreements, and then go on to what our study has shown. So a quick overview of the provisions of the Minsk Agreement. I won't go through all of this, but just to summarize the key elements. First of all, a ceasefire and withdrawal of heavy weapons, OSCE monitoring of the ceasefire, pardon and amnesty in relation to all events of the conflict, so that would be a blanket amnesty, regardless of what was done. release and exchange of hostages, safe access for humanitarian assistance, all that is good, of course. And then the really controversial point, dialogue towards local self-governance in what was titled as certain areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. So the idea was that those parts of the country that had been taken over by separatists would kind of return to Ukrainian control, but not totally, yeah? And of course, this is a bit of a Rorschach test of, what this kind of but not totally means. Vague agreements like this, which leave a lot of ambiguity in them, are then interpreted differently by all sides. And of course, the Minsk Agreements there are many other examples such as the Minsk Agreements. But the idea was then that in this context, the government of Ukraine would also undertake constitutional reforms to more generally decentralize Ukraine in order to enable these certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk to have local self-rule. So how did people feel about these agreements within Ukraine? Okay, now, very opposed political narratives, even from day one when those agreements were signed. First of all, the arguments in favor: it's the only way to resolve the conflict, short of all-out war, which Ukraine can't win, yeah? Or permanently abandoning the occupied territories. By the way, the terminology occupied territories is ubiquitous within Ukraine. The other terminology is non-government controlled areas, or NGCAs, or occupied territories. So there's no specific ethnic group living in that area to say, like we say in Cyprus, the area where the Greek Cypriot or Turkish Cypriot control, because they're all Ukrainians. So what are you going to call them? The Ukrainians who really like Russia? I mean, it's not so easy to define it in other ways. So one good thing about it is that it ends the conflict. It would restore good neighborly relations with Russia and therefore re-enable economic and cultural cooperation, which of course is really important for Eastern Ukraine, which is suffering due to the hard border that has now been erected between Ukraine and Russia. It would restore the territorial integrity of Ukraine, sort of, even through the special status arrangements. And of course, the ceasefire and exchange of prisoners is unambiguously positive on humanitarian grounds. I don't think no one disputes that. But against the Minsk Agreements are there's a long litany of arguments against that are actually quite widely shared. First of all, the narrative that granting special status rewards disloyalty and aggression and could prove to be a prelude to eventual formal secession, as in the case of Crimea, because Crimea was an autonomous republic within Ukraine before being annexed by Russia. So if you now grant special status and kind of an autonomous republic kind of status to certain parts of Donetsk and Lugansk, and then they hold a referendum to join Russia, what are you going to do about it? Yeah. So there's that kind of concern. There's also the Pandora's box concern that this would lead to similar demands by other regions of Ukraine that might lead to the country's fragmentation. We've got Transcarpathia, we've got southern Ukraine. There's all sorts of parts of the country that might say, okay, why not us as well? And of course, then we have the amnesty issue and the concern that granting a blanket amnesty is not only an insult to the victims, because even war criminals will get an amnesty. So, how does that work? But also, it would contaminate the Ukrainian body politic by enabling full political participation of unrepentant separatists, who would then go and argue for greater whatever with Russia. And finally, many believe that Minsk Agreements were designed explicitly to block Ukraine's path towards the West and keep the country tied to Russia's sphere of influence. So these are the arguments for and against, as it were. Now, what about the current study? What did we do? Well, our team has been working in Ukraine since 2016, so we've been there. I often joke that I think I've been to Ukraine probably more times than Paul Manafort. So, but I promise you, no money laundering in my case. But we've been doing a lot of research in Ukraine since 2016 and conducted several studies, including with adolescents in collaboration with UNICEF and investigating the experience of conflict-exposed adolescents. But in the case of this study, we focused on processes underpinning social and political cohesion through a countrywide longitudinal survey, with the wave 1 taking place in spring 2016 and wave 2 taking place in spring 2018. And we had almost 6,000 participants who participated in both waves and whose data which we could match from wave 1 to wave 2. Now, this is important from a methodological ground because you can actually investigate the trajectory of change, and you can see, okay, people who are more supportive of Minsk, what are they like? People who are less supportive of Minsk than they used to be, what are they like? People who have a stable, high support from Minsk, what are they like if they exist, as it were? This is part of a broader research program, the SCORE program, that we are running in different countries as well, and it's the countries that Anna mentioned in her introduction. And you can actually see a lot of this data online at scoreforpeace.org. We actually make the data available from several different countries, including the Ukraine data that I'm showing you here. Now, one of the questions that we had in the study was about Minsk Agreements. So the way we asked about Minsk was as follows. In February 2015, a package of measures was agreed in Minsk between Ukraine, Russia, and the leaders of self-proclaimed DPR and LPR, Donetsk People Republic and Luhansk People Republic, to alleviate the war in the Donbass. The measures include a ceasefire monitored by the OSCE, amnesty and release of prisoners, pull-out of foreign armed formations, provisions for local self-governance, in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk, and reintegration of these areas into Ukraine. Now, of course, people in Ukraine know the Minsk Agreements, but we wanted to give a baseline that we have told everyone the same thing. It's a bit of the package approach that Laura was mentioning before with the conjoint analysis. We didn't do conjoint analysis in this case. It would be a really interesting future step in the case of Ukraine. We only tested the specific package that has been specifically agreed by the sides. And then we asked, to what extent do you support or oppose the Minsk Agreements of February 2015 as a roadmap to peace? And we gave a thermometer 0 to 10 scale on that. And if you look at the results, so that's the 2016 results. And what you can see is that most people are 5 and above. You have a kind of bimodal distribution as well, because you have lots of people at 10 and lots of people at 0. And in 2018, what we are seeing is that actually the two edges have kind of fallen off. If you compare, if you compare the 10s and the 0s, they're much smaller than they used to be. And this is consistent with the public apathy that has been settling into Ukraine, and the difference regarding these agreements, to the extent that they haven't really led to anything concrete in Ukraine. So people are not so polarized around the agreements anymore. And if we look at this data on a map, what we see is that in 2016, people in the east and south of the country who have the greatest stake in the war ending due to their proximity to Russia. So the war is causing insecurity, and the war is disrupting family relations that those people have in Russia, and disrupting economic relations. So the motives are much greater. And we did see a lot higher support in the east and south. By the way, we also collected data in the non-government controlled areas. The scores there are even higher. They're like 9 out of 10. They're not shown in this diagram that you can download from the platform, but the scores are even higher. But the support is a lot more ambivalent in the west and center of the country, which is the more pro-Europe part of the country. And of course, this is really important because the country is led. Most of the ministers, the president, the governors of the different oblasts, most of them come from Western Ukraine at the moment. Yeah, I won't analyze the politics of Ukraine and what led to that. But now, again, in 2018, what we're seeing is that it becomes a bit more ambiguous. So people in east and south of Ukraine are not so unambiguously in favor of the Minsk Agreements anymore. And people in the West are not so opposed. Again, a regression towards the mean, really. That's what we're seeing here. But what about the longitudinal trajectories of change between 2016 and 2018? If we adopt a more person-centered approach, we conducted cluster analysis on support for Minsk in 2016 and 2018, and we identified 4 groups. One group that is showing decreasing support for Minsk. They had an average score of 7 out of 10 in 2016, then 2 out of 10 in 2018. Yeah? Another group with increasing support for Minsk, showing the opposite trajectory. Another group which is with stable low support, averaging 1 out of 10 in both time points. And another group that I was initially tempted to call stable high support, but then I renamed to stable moderate support, because it only averages about 7 out of 10. And that group is stable over the period. And this may be a more obvious, a more intuitive visualization of these results. Yeah. So we have here the stable low support group. It's only about 7% actually. We have the decreasing support group, which is 13%. We have the increasing support group, which is 18%. And we have the stable moderate support at 62%, which actually is a majority. So that sounds good, right? But there's a lot of devil in the detail about what this majority support means and how solid it is, or whether it's like a flaky asteroid. I will explain the problem in a moment. So now that we have the four groups, the next step in the analysis was to compare the groups and look at the profiles of these people. So if I'm someone with increasing support for Minsk or decreasing support for Minsk, what kind of person am I likely to be? What kind of intergroup, what kind of social psychological kind of dynamics are operating in my case, and what kind of political attitudes do I have, or psychosocial characteristics? So that's the next step of the analysis, and what I will do is I have the kind of analysis piece by piece, but what I will do is that I will, and I can come back to this, especially in the Q&A if necessary, but what I will do is that I will just focus on one or two here. This one is really important to focus on. So, and then I will show you the table where I'm integrating all the findings in one. So these are the four groups. Yeah, stable low is the dark green group, decreasing support is the light green, increasing support is the orange, and stable moderate is the dark orange. And we're seeing that stable low is showing higher pro-EU orientation, higher pro-NATO orientation, and slightly higher Ukrainian nationalism. But the difference is really strong when it comes to pro-EU and pro-NATO. Does that already sound strange? So if I'm pro-EU, I'm against the peace agreements. Yeah? So hold the sense of unreality a bit longer, okay? And now let me show you what happens with the pro-Russia geopolitical preferences. What we are seeing is that people with Soviet nostalgia and people who desire greater economic and political cooperation with Russia are in the stable high support for Minsk, stable moderate rather support for Minsk agreements group. Whereas again, the people who do not desire economic or political cooperation with Russia oppose the Minsk agreements. I'm going to then now show you an opposite perspective on this, which is, okay, so people who are pro-EU, which is a good thing, yeah, against the peace agreements, but now we also see that people who are against the peace agreements also have some more problematic traits. So, for instance, on social psychological indicators, the tendency to stereotype and experience social threats. Now, this was aggregated across groups. We also have the analysis of intergroup threat and intergroup stereotype towards each group separately, but we have aggregated based on the highest intergroup threat or the highest intergroup stereotype, which then gives you a sense of tendency to stereotype. And we are seeing that the people who are against Minsk are scoring higher there as well. And they're also scoring a little bit lower in pluralistic Ukrainian identity. They can't see, they're less likely to see a heterogeneous Ukrainian society. Now, when it comes to the group that is showing increasing support for Minsk, what we're finding is that they tend to be reporting greater satisfaction with with public services, and they are also reporting greater trust in national authorities than other groups. Whereas the people who are against the Minsk agreements are reporting greater concerns about corruption. And finally, people who are reporting decreasing support for Minsk appear to score higher in tolerance of corruption and readiness for political violence. So the people who were supporting the peace agreements but are now falling away from that, they seem to be what we can call maladaptive citizens, if that kind of quasi-clinical political term can be used, okay? And we are also seeing a higher tendency for aggression in that group. So, overview, yeah? What predicts patterns of support towards the Minsk agreements? So, stable low support is the group on the left, and as you can see, it's overdetermined, okay? There's lots and lots of reasons why people are opposed to the Minsk agreements, and a lot fewer reasons why people are in favor of the Minsk agreement. So even though a majority supports the Minsk agreements, it's actually hard to differentiate that group. And what we can see about the support group is that, first of all, they're characterized by desire for normalization of relations of Ukraine with Russia. They have elevated Soviet nostalgia. they accept the special status idea, and they're opposed to ongoing army operations. So it's a very simple argument. We want to be friends with Russia again, and the Minsk agreements are the only way forward. Okay? So it's a very simple, very obvious point. Whereas the people who are very low on the Minsk agreements, they're pro-EU and pro-NATO. They have total absence of Soviet nostalgia, and they have no desire for normalization of relations with Russia. What these people are saying is, we need to be taking the country towards the West and towards the European Union, and the Minsk agreements is basically a way of holding us back. Okay? It's a way of holding us tied to Russia's sphere of influence through the Minsk agreements. And as well as the geopolitics, they seem to have an enhanced sensitivity to human rights. So that's where the amnesty issue comes in, and that's where the sense of the sense of anger over the injustices included in the Minsk agreements comes in. They also have higher civic responsibility, self-reported civic responsibility, enhanced support for reforms, and also at the same time greater tendency to stereotype and experience social threat. So it's a very, now for us who've been working in Ukraine for a few years, this is no longer strange, but I can totally understand that this may sound like a strange combination. Yeah, but this is the reality of Ukraine at the moment. And when we look at the increasing support group, so those who were against the Minsk agreements in 2016 but have grown to be supportive, now they report basically what they're saying is that the social contract has been working for them. They have greater satisfaction with services. They have greater trust in authorities. They perceive reduced corruption. And they therefore trust the government's effort for peace through the Minsk agreements. That's my reading of this data. They also have a greater desire for resolution through peaceful dialogue. So over time, they have come to accept and support the Minsk agreements as the only way forward. Those who are showing decreasive support, as I mentioned, there seem to be a psychosocial basis for maladaptive citizenship there. So we're seeing reduced family coherence, aggressive traits, tolerance of corruption, and readiness for political violence. So now the question is, if 62%, and I'll end in a moment, so if 62% of people in Ukraine are supporting the Minsk agreements, does that mean that it's going in the right direction? And no, actually not at all. Actually, in the presidential elections that are happening now, we're between the first and the second round of the presidential elections, and we will know on the 21st of April who will be the final victor. We have actually seen all the major candidates distance themselves from the Minsk agreements. So Tymoshenko was totally against; he was throwing them in the rubbish bin. Poroshenko was saying yes, who is the current president who actually signed the agreement for Ukraine. He said, of course, the Minsk agreement is important, but we should also include Crimea in the package to discuss. Which, of course, is a clever way of putting it, because if you include Crimea, then basically the package deal will be that Russia can keep Crimea and we get Donetsk back without any special conditions. I think that's where this is going. But of course, it also means that you totally abandon the Minsk agreements, because that's a totally separate package. And then Zelensky, who is he is seen as a more pro-dialogue with Russia candidate, not a pro-Russia candidate, but a more pro-dialogue candidate. Even he feels the need to say, oh, well, it's not, we need to amend the Minsk agreements by including the UK and the US are on the table as well. So that's a clever way of slightly distancing himself, but not in a way that would totally undermine prospects for getting back on the table. And of course, just a funny one here. This is all newspapers from the last month, by the way. UN Security Council meeting on Minsk peace deal slated for late evening today. The declared reason is the 4th anniversary of the signing of the Minsk agreements. So they're already celebrating the anniversary of the agreement that has never been implemented. I think that what is happening in Ukraine is that we have a minority conversion effect, which has undermined political support for the Minsk agreements. So what we have here is a small but vocal opposition with detailed but well-articulated arguments, which is gradually winning the political space against a vaguely positive but ambivalent majority, which actually lacks strong arguments or motives for its pro-Minsk position. And I think that's why the 7% is actually winning the political space over the 62%. My second observation is that it's difficult to see how the Minsk process can proceed in its substantive aspects. Ceasefire is all good, nothing controversial there, but as to the substantive aspect of as a roadmap to peace, so I don't think it can proceed while it is perceived by so many as an impediment to, or even incompatible with, Ukraine's EU prospects. The argument that it's a distraction is actually very strong in Ukraine, and it's actually quite hard to argue against it, because the moment you reintegrate Eastern Ukraine and its 3 million pro-Russia population, that's the kind of thinking that is going on in people's mind at the moment. I think the issues of amnesty and special status will continue to provoke negative reactions, and therefore the Minsk Agreements actually risk becoming a permanent impediment to peace if controversial elements are not revisited, for instance, amnesty, and that's where conjoint analysis could be really useful if there is political space to actually have a conversation. So, for instance, can we think about amnesty, but only for those who haven't committed war crimes, for instance? Or instead of having special status, can we have sensible decentralization for all oblasts, but without permanent special status for specific regions of Donetsk and Luhansk? So these are some of the proposals that would need to be put in, but we are in a situation where there is a third party, there is an external influencer, Russia. Just like in Cyprus, there is an external influencer, which is Turkey. So we have to be careful about making these kind of bicommunal assumptions that we have two sides, and if we can get the two sides to find the common positions, and that's okay, and that will solve it, we need to somehow find a way to integrate the geopolitics of this into our algorithm. So in the meantime, as we are waiting for a more positive environment, for more positive conditions to actually have peace negotiations, what can actually help with a more positive environment, based on the findings of this study, is first of all better governance with improved service delivery and reduced corruption. This increases trust in the state, and therefore increases trust in whatever negotiations the state will conduct on behalf of citizens. And I think this also applies for Cyprus. Secondly, building more pluralistic and tolerant identities based on skills for dialogue, participation, and coexistence, while addressing the phenomenon of far-right nationalism. That's also an element of the anti-peace agenda. And normalizing this a two-step narrative for political change. So first, complete internal reforms and more closely aligned with the European Union. I'm not sure whether full membership is possible or is on the cards. I think that's a totally different conversation. But that has to be done first, and people need to feel secure in that process first, and then pursue reconciliation in the East and with Russia, but in a spirit of sovereign equality between Ukraine and Russia. And that really is the key issue. So I think there's lots of interesting similarities between Ukraine and Cyprus that we may want to jointly reflect upon. And sorry for taking up longer than I should have.
Thank you, Alexandros, for a very interesting presentation and comparison between the Ukraine and Cyprus. I am very much tempted in making some political comments, but I will not. I will just comment on the beauty of the SCORE methodology that Alexandros and the team are using, of which I'm very familiar with. And it's quite scary how it can turn the simple into something very complicated, and then break down the complicated into something simple. So it's a very interesting methodology, because, as Alexandros also said, the devil is in the details. So it's good to know the detail behind decisions and stereotypes, and the shifting of people's perceptions about politics. And I keep one other point that was made about the amnesty, because it's something that we've been talking about in Cyprus, where the truth commissions or justice is important into bringing about sustainable peace. So that's another very big question that I'm not so sure that we do have the answer to that. So now I will open the floor to questions or comments from the audience. We can allocate 15 minutes to that. So I would ask everybody to try and be brief and possibly identify themselves before making the question or stating their position on certain things, and actually clarifying to which speaker the question or comment is addressed. Yes, Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. Pavlos Anastasiadis from Famagusta. I think that talks to the commitment and aspiration, but also to differentiate from some other person who bears the same surname. It was music to my ears, Huseyin, what you heard. It took me back some 40 years plus with Henry Tashfeld and Mike Billing. The theoretical introduction, just perfect. One methodological question, if I may. You kept saying that that more contact increases this and this and that. Have you actually done a within-subject longitudinal study to assert that, or is it simply a correlational observation which possibly might be attributed to some other parameter which might be responsible for both having more contact and certain other dependent variables that you observed? And just one little observation, if I may say, property and home is not the same thing. And a lot of the emotional attachment that we have is not to property, it's to home, Heimat, as the Germans say, Estia, as in Greek you have. So I think that's something that has to be differentiated.
We'll take another question and then we'll allow the speakers to respond. Yes.
I also got a question which is similar to the previous one, and so along the same lines, with regards to the returning Greek Cypriot IDPs to their properties under Turkish Cypriot administration. I feel that it does not really have to do so much with Greek Cypriots fearing ordinary Turkish Cypriots, but it's more of a concern regarding institutional treatment towards the Greek Cypriots who decide to move to their properties. Institutional treatment having to do with how the police or the judiciary system or even the lack of educational provisions for those who decide to return are available to the community. So I think that could possibly be one of the factors making Greek Cypriots skeptical as to their possible return or endorsing such a prospect. And I would like to have a comment on this one. How do we safeguard their decision to return and provide for conditions that would make them institutionally feel protected so that they can have an ordinary life in their previous properties? Thanks.
That's a very good observation. Thank you. In terms of the methodology, we have ongoing research at the moment that we are looking at the change across time, but we can only speak as much as our measures. We have other research, longitudinal research, saying the same similar effects of contact on a number of other, if I can say, outgroup attitudes, decreasing or improving the intergroup relations, the effect of contact, longitudinal evidence. But I think this was, Charis will correct me if I'm mistaken, this was the first time that we asked in terms of the cross-sectional aspects, that we ask about the return motivations. So this is a first. But there is already ongoing research, if I'm not mistaken, that we're looking at that as well. And in terms of the terminology, I do apologize that it was a choice, it was the wrong choice of words, to be honest. I do accept that. For the simplicity that we actually in the research we frame our questions returning to especially the attachment questions and the identification questions. We framed it in terms of home, not in terms of properties. So I do accept that. And for the perceptions of threats, you can only cover certain aspects of the psychological processes. So what I presented was only a chunk of what people perceive, of course, using already established and validated measures. In order to give a better picture, we need, of course, what kind of expectations they have and what kind of measures the politicians or the decision makers can put in place to elevate those perceptions?
Actually, in our first study, we have asked exactly about the factors that make Greek Cypriots avoid returning under Turkish Cypriot administration or promoting their return. And there was a very interesting finding there because it answers directly to your question. So we compared the factor of having an international peacekeeping force offering protection in case of a solution and return, or comparing that if they felt that Turkish Cypriots are welcoming, so a more interpersonal sense of security. And as you will see there, the second one was a more important factor in facilitating return compared to the first one. So I remember discussing that in a previous conference, that we tend to underestimate the aspect of human security, and we overstate the aspects of military security. That was also found by Alexandros and a lot of his research in Cyprus on the score index, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, in an alternate universe where Ukraine was a standalone, was a kind of an island in Southeast Asia, it would have been a wonderful case for federation. Of course, it's such a diverse, it's a huge diverse country. It could really benefit from the enhanced democracy of a decentralized governance structure that allows the East, the West, the South, the center of the country to each contribute in their own way through a federal governance system. However, what is happening in Ukraine and generally in the whole of the post-Soviet era is that generally Russia wants federations all around it. Yeah, ideally Russia would want every country, every post-Soviet country to be a federation, with the pro-Russia population in every country controlling some federated units, which then Russia could indirectly control through them. So, and this is really the concern about federation in Ukraine and in other countries in the region where Russia is meddling. Yes, of course, federation, of course, decentralization can be a good thing, and of course, federation is one way to decentralize and enhance local sovereignty, as it were. But when the price is that then you create a state entity that is tacitly controlled by an external actor and maybe then gradually taken in the direction of secession. Now, and of course in Ukraine it's not a hypothetical conversation because that's exactly what happened with Crimea. It was an autonomous republic. You could have said that it's a federated, you could have called it a federated republic within Ukraine, and it was annexed by Russia. So there is actual evidence of that having happened already that totally cools down people's excitement about federation. And of course, there is the other, now decentralization is going on. There is a very active decentralization push. There is a lot of decentralization reforms being taken through parliament to enhance the authority of oblast administrations. And there's 24, Ukraine is comprised of 24 oblasts, and each of them is larger than Cyprus. Yeah? So so those local governments are being given a lot of authority, and also at the local government level as well, at the rayon level, which is the municipality level. The problem there is lack of capacity and corruption, because what happens is that when you are taking away centralized corruption, when you haven't changed the culture of corruption, what you do with decentralization is that you switch over centralized corruption for decentralized corruption. So these are some of the issues and tensions. Now, you see, I am deliberately avoiding making the obvious contrast that we could make with Cyprus regarding the meaning of federalism. No, I guess I've made it now. But I think one of the arguments of those who are more skeptical of federation in Cyprus is very similar to the argument of those who are skeptical in federation in Ukraine. Of course, I think they have a much stronger case than the anti-federationists have in Cyprus. But it's again, are we having federation so that people can have better self-governance and more human security, or are we having federation so that one of the federated units can be driven by an external actor? Yeah. So So I think that's a lot of food for thought. I'm not going to take a position on that personally.
Just one comment on the issue of schools, because in the first study we also asked about the importance people attributed to having schools for their children. And you are very right. As you can see here, the orange bar shows that the majority, when being asked, they consider it either somehow important or very important factor, and it's much more important than having other members of your community returning with you. So the prospect of the future, it's much more important for people somehow going back and their children also being able to return. And for example, despite the fact that we knew of this kind of research and the importance of discussions, these issues, they have never been discussed. I would say the most sensitive and important issues have not been discussed because of lack of political will, lack of coordination between the committees, and secondly, lack of a sense of transparency, because there were things already discussed on the negotiation table and agreed that we didn't know in terms of education.
And with regards to the school issue, actually, within the psychological cost measures, there are questions directly asking people to agree or disagree about anticipated problems with the education of their children, anticipated problems that their children will have in the new place. So that's also incorporated within, at least in the results that I presented. The school issue is covered within the psychological cost measures, anticipated psychological cost measures.
The kids can choose to take Turkish. And of course, there is a Turkish studies department here at university. Plus, there are Turkish language classes for adults offered as afternoon lessons. And the ministry has given me that information, so I think it's quite reliable. Just a final word. If I could just summarize in 1-2 sentences what's been said here, and some important things have been said, is that we need to dispel the fear about the day after. And all the information we got here today is that there is no transparency, there is not much inclusion, there is not much of a democratic process within the negotiating teams. So all this creates, it basically propagates the feeling of uncertainty that the people feel. And just to use something from the research we've done with Alexandros, with SEED, a core group of no voters back in 2004 among the Greek Cypriot community were the women. So we felt we had to ask the women, why was that so? Now, we didn't get any nationalist, racist rhetoric when we did the focus groups or the questionnaires. The questions we got, the concerns we got were, where will my kids go to school? What kind of health services will be available? What kind of national security system will there be? And what kind of pension will we get? So this was the basic, the nitty-gritty of daily lives that's never been discussed, and nobody knows exactly if it's being decided, who is deciding it, and what is being decided. So on this final and hopefully not very pessimistic note, I will ask you now to go outside and have some lovely coffee and return for the next panel, which is a roundtable on George Anderson's co-edited Territory Empowering Constitutional Transitions, chaired by Neophytos Loizidis, with commentaries by Aristotelis Kosandinidis and Emel actually. Thank you.